We're live.
Hello, we are live. This is the podcast of That Word. I do not think it means what you think it means. So I am Matthew. I'm here with my co-host and co-author Shimon. And we want to discuss a little bit today. This is kind of a sequel to and that's the book we wrote. This is a kind of sequel to the recent Gamecast podcast that we did about a tweet storm that one of my favorite sort of professor thinkers, a guy named Scott Galloway, who's at NYU, and he's been very, very active the last few years, writing articles in like the Chronicle and stuff, talking about the ridiculous overinflation of the college costs for students and how crazy the margins are, and how unfair that is for the students to go out with that sort of cost and then debt burden to get a degree to go build their lives. So when the GameStop thing happened, he made a tweet that it was like he used GameStop to make a point that he loves making. Which is that if young men don't have opportunities to build a viable economic life, then they don't have a chance to build a viable family life at an early age in their 20s or 30s. They don't have a chance to buy a house. If they're not stable in income, they have a lot less chance of getting married. And then, society can become really, really destabilized. Like that was considered one of the major factors of the Arab Spring, was that there was an awful lot of young men who didn't have a chance to get ahead in life. So I wanted to start it there, and I believe we posted the link to the tweet storm. Galloway's post, which was very thoughtful, was of course misread and misrepresented by some, politically correct pundits who wanted to say he's blaming women for not giving enough sex to men, which it took some serious mental gymnastics to get from what he said to what they accused him of saying. But that made it get on the radar of a lot of people. And on that level, I think it's a good thing. So I wanted to start there.
I'm just shocked to hear that people misinterpreted what somebody meant. That just seems completely antithetical to what goes on in our society on a day-to-day basis. I don't know if I have to can I put a physical sarcasm hashtag up there or something? I don't know. I feel like I need a paddle. That's. I mean, on the face of his text, it does kind of seem like he was kind of making that suggestion, but obviously he's working at a broader point, and people decided to take the more literal versus the broader point. And I guess that is a kind of a deep problem that has kind of arisen out of the world that we live in. Maybe you want to spend a few more minutes or seconds elaborating on that problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's worthwhile to read Galloway's tweets. Basically, I mean, the core point, he says, a bored and angry young man is the most dangerous person in the world. When countries have unemployed young men who are single, the likelihood that country goes to war escalates. And we have cut the share of wealth of young people in half in the last 30 years. 30 years ago, people in their 20s and 30s had 19% of the national wealth. And now we're at somewhere around 9% or maybe even less. So then he goes on to say, arm young men in a basement, not at work, not having sex, not forming connections, with a Robinhood account, a phone, and a stimulus check, and you have a perfect storm of volatility as they wage war against the established players while squeezing the dopa bag harder and harder. And the other piece of his tweet, he said, what happened here with GameStop? He said, it's about sex, specifically young men not having enough sex. Sex leads to relationships, obligations, and guardrails. Parentheses, don't get in fights. We need you. Don't gamble your paycheck. We need to save for a house.
So I actually...
This is a provocative way to make his point. but he made a point.
I will say that is an interesting point that I'm not sure that he was making. But when you were talking about the fall of the drop off of the share of wealth that's controlled by people between the ages of 20 and 30, one of the things that I did think about was the notion that 30 years ago, people in that age bracket were already forming families. Like it was the norm 30 years ago by the time you were in your early to mid 20s to be married with, maybe a child or two. Whereas today, like that's completely abnormal. And so maybe there's a reverse causal, I don't know, relationship there, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, for sure, there's a look. I mean, I know because I follow Galloway that his subtext is always, college. He's, I think, implying, look, if you graduated college 30 years ago, the cost of it was a lot less, and the amount of debt burden was a lot less, overwhelmingly. So if in your 20s and 30s you don't have much student debt, you have even with everything else being equal, you'd have a lot better chance of building wealth in your 20s and 30s if you have $15,000 of student loans instead of $150,000. So that's a piece of the narrative that I think he's implying.
Oh, I mean, definitely, and we discussed this a little bit the last time. A little bit the last time we spoke, we talked a little bit about kind of the issues of kind of college and the moral hazards involved in kind of the federal implicit guarantee or explicit guarantee of college debt. That has led to, in a lot of ways, the explosion of the cost of college. So I definitely think that that's a problem that faces our society. But I don't know if that is the only explanation.
Well,
Once again, like I was saying, is that
no,
yes, debt is a problem.
It's not the
yes,
only
college debt. Right. Yes, debt is a problem. Yes, college debt is certainly a problem, especially because it's the only form of debt that is not expunged through bankruptcy, which is a little bit crazy. But once again, I think that part of the drive and that decrease in control of wealth has to do with more the lack of forming attachments, which our society is increasingly bad at doing.
Yes. So it's all wrapped up. And I think what you said at the beginning, actually, even though it was sarcastic about misunderstanding and misrepresenting, I heard, I don't remember whether it was Eric Weinstein or who, but somebody said that misunderstanding very often is deliberate in the sense of, I don't want to have that conversation. I want to have a different conversation. So in this case, misunderstanding what Galloway was saying, Galloway is kind of saying we need to have a much bigger conversation about what kinds of attachments are young men forming, what kinds of opportunities are there, what factors are putting them in a situation where they can't build the wealth that makes it a lot easier to build attachments. What are the demographics, like the structural problem, the biggest structural problem in America and the West, according to at least an Eric Weinstein, is not racism, it's demographics. It's the older generations, the boomer generation, not giving up power and not allowing younger people to get, whether it's scientific grants or promotions in companies or university professorships and tenure and university president jobs, or it's just access to capital. There's a conversation or a set of conversations that we want to have. And the critics of Scott Galloway here didn't want to have that conversation. It's like, that's a scary conversation for them. So instead they want to talk about how he's just blaming women for not putting out, which is not what he said. Like I said, that was a very creative misrepresentation of what he's saying. But the way they're misunderstanding him is pointing us to the fact that they don't want to have a certain conversation. That's what I think we need to hear. That's what I want to bring attention to. Why wouldn't they want to have that conversation? What's scary to them about having that conversation? Or conversations? Like you said, there's multi-factors here. There's young men not forming attachments. There's student debt. There's difficulties getting into the economy and being promoted. There's the fact that we had 10 years after the 2008 crash of let's just say a certain set of limitations on growth that grew out of monetary policy and stuff that have made it really, really hard for a couple of generations. I think you and I are technically in different generations, like Gen X and millennial or whatever, but we're not very far apart in age. But even so, like our generations have not. We are the first generations in American history to not be as wealthy as our parents in all sorts of measures, and at the same stages of life. So there's a lot of reasons for that, but those are really important conversations because it speaks to what's sort of more and more broken about Western society right now. That I think is a much bigger danger to us than some alleged white supremacist tweeting or getting onto Parler or something. I feel like we're at a lot more danger because the sort of fundamentals of our society are breaking, and he's ripping the Band-Aid off that wound by posting this tweet. And so, of course, instead of taking him seriously, people are like, well, he's just blaming women for not sleeping with these young men who are living in their parents' basements.
Yeah, I guess that's unfortunate. I guess where do we go from here is, I guess, the question.
Right. I mean, of course, I have ideas on how to fix this. I was listening to Eric Weinstein talking to, I think, Lex Fridman, and basically saying we probably can't fix anything until we can get the people who are in power, and by power, not just, Biden and whatever, but also like the people who run the New York Times. I mean, he said this, and I identified it with it very strongly. He was saying, like, basically, my friends and family who've known me my entire life and know that I have, a PhD and that I'm brilliant and that I've been, successful and I work for Teal Capital and all this stuff. And they've known me for decades personally, and they've seen my expertise and my intelligence and my arguing. And yet one sentence in the New York Times can make them dismiss me as a crackpot. The level of respect that they give to the authority of the official narrative still overwhelms anything that I can say to them. So I've had that experience myself recently with my own family. They're like, hey, here's the thing that I just spent, weeks or months or years like deep diving into, and I know a lot about this. And hey, here's an interesting thing. And they'll just be like, well, that sounded a tiny bit like something I might have heard that somebody said that Ben Shapiro said, so therefore you're wrong. Because the New York Times said that you're wrong, so therefore you're wrong. And it's like, whoa, what just happened here? Something went way off the rails with that.
Well, I think that's why it's important to kind of go on and have conversations. Because I disagree with at least your portrayal of what Eric Weinstein had to say. He's not here to defend himself, so it'd be hard for me to tell him that I disagree with him directly. But I think the notion that we have to wait for something to fix problems is really the wrong way to go about things, because by waiting, nothing is going to change, if that makes sense. Those who have that kind of power are not going to relinquish it easily, and when they do, they're going to do their darndest to relinquish it to their kind of ideological children, if that, obviously maybe not actual hereditary children, but ideological children. And that's actually one of the things that I think is destroying, for example, the New York Times that you brought up. The story over the summer that they ran the editor of the opinion section out because he dared publish a piece by Tom Cotton. Like, that's not, the 80-year-old politicians that did that. That's the young millennials or Gen Zers that are now working at the New York Times saying that, we're in charge now. So I think the problems get worse, not better, by just waiting. I think that we need to kind of figure out how to address these things head on and figure out how to grow critical mass behind it over time, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and look, I don't know that he would disagree with that. I think I was sort of, paraphrasing him from a pessimistic moment, that he was afraid that no matter what we try to do, as long as we can be so easily discredited. I mean, the way that our sort of larger media ecosystem works right now, it's hard to build credibility. It's hard to build an audience. You can do it over the course of time, but it's very easy to destroy your credibility. And that can happen very quickly. And you saw it happen with, like, for example, Tulsi Gabbard. As soon as she started to sort of make a little bit of noise as somebody interesting and kind of
Russian
outside
agent.
Right. It was like, well, she's an Assad stooge. And it was like, she's no more an Assad stooge than the other 2/3 of Congress who've been involved in, delegations to Syria over the course of the last 30 years. United States Department of Defense has an office in the Syrian Department of Defense. It's part of the United States government overview. Everybody's an Assad stooge in the United States government by that standard. But they discredited her, and nothing I could say to people in the entire buildup of the election, all of the primary voters, and I'd say, I want to at least look at Tulsi Gabbard. She's not necessarily my favorite, but she's got some interesting things to say. It was like, no, she's an Assad stooge. They just rule it out because the New York Times said so.
So one of the, I think, is interesting is that is one of the things that Donald Trump focused on early in his campaign, was to just completely discredit those discreditors, essentially, by jumping out there and making all this noise about fake news media. What he did was expose. He just held up a mirror to the public as to what the kind of guardians of what Eric Weinstein calls the gated institutional narrative, right? Where they can just at whim discredit somebody like Tulsi Gabbard who might be interesting, right? And he just kind of said, hey, you guys those people are not just giving you objective, honest truth like you trust them to do and have consistently trusted them to do over time. And this is something that I've been thinking about kind of a lot lately, is that we live in this kind of weird post-truth reality where it used to be that you could just go through your life and believe, what the media told you was going on. And now it's from all sides. It's completely broken down, right? You have multiple side-by-side quote truths, or more correctly narratives, that are running concurrently, and actually figuring out which one is true and which one is not true is a lot more work than one might imagine, and definitely more work than your average person is going to put in. And while that was always true, it was always true that people were not going to take the time to figure this out. Once upon a time, we did trust certain organizations to figure it out for us and kind of give us kind of the overall picture of what at least it is. We may not go for one or the other, but that's kind of breaking down. And I think it broke down, and Trump just pointed out that it was broken, rather than Trump having broken it, if that makes sense.
It does. I don't know if he so much pointed out that it was broken. It was more like he demonstrated that it was broken. And every day that you paid attention to what he actually said versus what was the official narrative of what he allegedly did or said, there was such a gap there that it magnified the sort of cognitive dissonance. And I think a third of America sort of saw that the dominant narrative had broken, but that doesn't mean that people became more sane. A lot of them just sort of retreated into other narratives about what was going on, some of which were crazy, some of which were QAnon, some of which were fed by Trump himself, which were not reality either. And then the sort of, let's call it half the country that sort of doubled down on Biden, doubled down on believing in the old school democratic and official institutions. I feel like they shut down. In order to keep believing and voting for that, they had to either go into the anti-Trump hysteria, or they had to sort of go into an even more extreme lesser of evils thing. Like, in 2000, you could say, okay, I'm going to vote Democratic because it's the lesser of two evils, but they're not a giant difference. In 2008, you could say that, even in 2012. But by the time you get to 2020, when Trump has sort of ripped away the veil and shown you that, all these official narratives are more concerned with winning than they are with being truthful, that's sort of proven beyond any reasonable doubt, you wind up with people doubling down into this like very totalitarian, like, well, my side must be right. And even if they're lying, it's justified because that helped defeat Trump. So we're seeing that with the Time Magazine thing too. It's like, it sounds like big tech, the big social media companies actively collaborated with the Democratic Party to make sure that Trump wouldn't win. I don't know what to think about it anymore, but I feel like this is not a good. This is a big gap between truth and what we're being told is truth. And most people know that it's a gap and they're okay with that. And that scares me because it reminds me of China. that's where I'm at.
I just don't know how you go about fixing that personally. I mean, I vehemently disagree with the notion that we have to wait for something to fix it, but I don't know how you go about kind of fixing it.
Yeah, and I'm not saying maybe I used the word waiting in the wrong line.
No, that's fine. We can get past the waiting. I'm more in the. I'm not sure.
I mean, Weinstein wasn't saying we shouldn't do anything. He was more warning that any outlet.
But it's going to take a long time to get better. That's what he was saying.
Right. That because of the sort of win or loss. If you can work really long and hard to build an audience, like a Joe Rogan or whatever, but you can be discredited almost overnight. So he's sort of expecting that to happen for himself. I think if our little podcast came across his radar, he'd probably say that that's likely to happen to us. And I think you've even said that you think if we get big enough for people to listen to us, we'll get, either discredited or accused of being, I don't know what, white supremacists, Zionists, God knows what we are these days.
I'm going to yes and just all of that, right? Which will probably be the clip now that they use to completely discredit us, which is fine. I think one of the genius things about Joe Rogan, and I mean, I titled this episode "Random Thoughts," so we may jump around a little bit. One of the genius things about Joe Rogan is that he always holds himself up as a moron. Whenever they talk about this, that, or the other, he's like, "No, I'm just a moron. What do you want from me? I'm just a guy who sits in this chair and interviews interesting people and has interesting conversations." And I think that people kind of accept that persona. Joe Rogan is, at least I've listened to a fair amount of his podcast. It's obviously not a moron, right? He's got to be a very, very smart man, but he manages to hold up this persona to kind of keep it kind of as unthreatening as possible. And he's also controls a massive audience. So there comes a certain scale where you just can't be discounted. And so I think you're right. I think your Eric Weinsteins of the world are kind of in this kind of in the middle, this mid gap where they're like, they have a following and they have an audience, but they may still be cancelable from that perspective. And cancelable, I mean, from the big tech perspective, not from the kind of angry mob perspective, although it's very possible they can be canceled by an angry mob also. Like this kind of goes back to what you're talking about, Scott Galloway, who it's like he was trying to say something and they decided the angry mob tried to cancel him instead of, because they're like, oh, he said something about sex. He must hate women.
Yes. Oh, there was a lot interesting there. Yeah.
That's what I do.
Wait, let me reel it back to the thing before the thing. The first thing you said. Well, Joe Rogan, I think part of what we no longer we have a vocabulary for it, but you almost never hear it. Where is there wisdom in the world? Right? There's lots of knowledge, there's expertise, there's authority, there's power. We talk about all these things every day in our sort of mainstream media, but we very rarely talk about someone actually being wise, which would imply they have good judgment that isn't dependent on a field of expertise. And you and I, having been in and around the Jewish religious world, we know when we run into somebody who's like, we would respect their wisdom, not just about a specific, very specialized point of Jewish law, where obviously they would have an expertise, but about actual wisdom about moral things. And I think what Joe Rogan has succeeded in doing, by being very humble about what he knows and what he doesn't know, because there's a few subjects where he will jump in and say, wait a second, I'm actually not a moron when it comes to MMA fights. I'm not a moron when it comes to stand-up comedy and what made stand-up comedy work and not work. I'm not a moron when it comes to fitness and professional high-level athletic training and what it takes to be in good shape and make your body operate at high performance, because I've devoted a huge amount of effort and deep dive and knowledge for many, many years. So sometimes, like, I remember he was talking with some of the various doctors and experts and activists talking about trans and whatnot, and they would talk about a whole bunch of things, and then he'd be like, hold up. When it comes to actual athletic competition, you can't tell me that suddenly taking a giant amount of testosterone is not going to affect your athletic ability in a competition if you're a woman. Like, I know this because I actually know this. So implicit in his ability to make that distinction is wisdom. And I think those of us who listen to him a lot, we recognize that he has those specific areas of knowledge, but the wisdom to know where he's a generalist asking interesting questions and where he's an expert. I feel like that's the sort of core of wisdom that has been lost in a lot of the rest of this.
Yeah, I'm an expert on very little, to be honest. But I think I think you raised a good point as kind of wisdom. I always thought it was the white beard that made the rabbis wise, but hey.
It does help. Well, no, but like, it makes a big difference that, like, when we talk about GameStop, you're able to actually step in and say, well, wait a second, I actually did do specific options and short trading with respect to specifically the GameStop stock, not right now, but a couple of years ago. And that gives you a hands-on expertise. You know how to trade these things. That's different from those of us who are kind of on the outside looking in. So you can be humble, but certain areas, real estate, certain kinds of finance, you have a business degree. And I have my areas of expertise as well. I hope that we are both kind of the kind of people who, bring a little broader perspective. I hope that makes us worthy to be canceled. That would be kind of an honor.
Something to work towards, Matthew.
Yes.
In our spare time. But powering through that, there's a number of kind of directions that you went as far as kind of things that you pointed out from Scott Galloway that you found interesting. And are there any that you want to kind of pick apart and kind of move forward in this conversation, possibly?
Well, I do think that, the coronavirus lockdowns and limitations have sort of brought out a tension that was implicit in what he's saying. The caricature of it, he's saying young men living in their parents' basements. I think the way the world works, no matter how much sort of government support you're giving to people, ultimately, if people aren't, some degree of self-sufficient, it's a big strain on the larger world. there's only so many, so to speak, non-productive people. And I don't mean that everyone has to be working at full capacity as slaves to the capitalist machine, but like if you're not paying your own bills, and you're not working to pay your own bills, it impacts everyone around you. You're not living a life of usefulness. You're not living a life of dignity. You're not in touch with your own purpose. You're not getting up every morning to do something. We all benefit from people who are working in various formats, in various, putting their effort and trying to pursue their dreams, all add sort of value to the world. I'm overgeneralizing. Obviously, you could put a lot of work into stock scams or parasitic, terrible things, but most people who work are adding a certain amount of value. When you have a certain critical mass of people who are not working, even though that's because of this externally imposed coronavirus, lockdown and slowdown, and it's deeply corrosive to people's life cycles, to the ability to do anything in life, and your frustrations around it. And that's what's really interesting to me about the sort of conversation that nobody seems to want to have.
So actually, I think that's very interesting kind of perspective, given also kind of past conversations that we've had. And I think kind of from an attribution perspective, as it were, what's interesting is that these young men of which you speak that live in their parents' basements, that there's an increasing number of them, let's say, they have no responsibilities, they have no attachments, which means that they're actually at that prime place in life where they can figure out how to add value without having to work per se, if that makes sense. I mean, you don't have to, and this is something that I learned a lot from you and from people that share more kind of liberal left perspective, and that is that its value is not necessarily determined by work, right? I mean, work is one of the ways you add value. Work in kind of in the sense of a job, but you have these people that are sitting there, and it's like they don't, like, what are they doing, right? They're playing video games, it's like, which is kind of like a base kind of hitting that, as you said, dopamine bag, right? It's like, what am I doing? I'm just kind of doing the thing to kind of get to the next moment that provides the most amount of pleasure. Whereas if people would, from a younger age, kind of take that opportunity to go out and figure out more things that are interesting to them and kind of contribute to the world body of knowledge, science, art, creativity, business, something, right? That they might think things might be better. I think of kind of Jordan Peterson and his kind of like the effect he's had on people, on young men, and that kind of like, that was his targeted demo. It was like, here's a book, 12 Rules for Life, read it and figure out how to like make something of yourself, because just sitting there and doing nothing is not going to help you. And he caught a lot of hate for it also, but hey, there's something interesting going on there. It's like, what allows for that and what drives that that ability to kind of, I guess part of that is the sheer amount of prosperity that we have as a world. And I know people are going to kind of argue with me about that, but it's like today we are, even the poorest people in this country are some of the richest people in history, just from a sheer material perspective. It's like, yes, there is food insecurity in this country. Yes, there are people that have serious problems, but on average, on the whole, and even those people with kind of that suffer from food insecurity are not anywhere near, like sub-Saharan Africa, which I think even they're starting to kind of conquer food insecurity, right? I mean, nobody in this country is literally starving. I mean, they may be starved for good, solid, healthy nutrition, but there's just so much wealth that, and I think part of the problem is that we've chosen as a society to measure kind of wealth in relative terms within the society, rather than measure wealth in kind of absolute terms, and how do you think about the fact that, I mean, the fact that a 30-year-old man can sit in his parents' basement implies that his parents have a basement for him to sit in, right? They can put the food on the table that, like, 200 years ago he would have had to get off his butt and go out and find. Like, it's the prosperity that we've felt as a society and experienced as a society that allows for that to even exist, and kind of leaves it aimlessly, right? Because people people are people produce out of necessity, if that makes sense. I often think back. I mean, I got married at a relatively young age, but I think about what could I have done to be even more productive before I'd formed those attachments, and how that might have set my life trajectory up differently.
Yes. Oh, I like this. Right. I think some of it comes back to the word that we have in our book as one of our sort of misunderstood words, which is job. A lot of people use the word job as a proxy for a life of utility and value and purpose and validation and recognition and reward. A job is not necessarily any of those things, but it's sort of almost close enough to most of those things that people say, well, people need jobs. And like you said, like, this is revealing that we don't necessarily all need to have jobs in order to have the essentials that we need to live at very, very, like you said, by world historical standards, very high standard of living. Even those who are struggling and poor and barely making rent or not making rent or moving back into their parents' basements or moving into homeless shelters are still living better than the masses of the middle upper classes in the 1700s Poland, or wherever whatever comparison point you want to do back in time. We have better antibiotics, we have better sanitation, we have clean water, we have all sorts of things. But if you are not above the threshold of having some purpose to your life every day, I think what Scott Galloway's tweet is getting at is that no matter what the level of sort of objective material standard we're talking about, if people don't have anything to do, like, you still can't get around that people are people. Like, people need something to do that isn't necessarily a job, isn't necessarily externally productive. It could be, like you said, creative or all these things, but it's interpersonal. There needs to be some way that it's recognized, validated, seen, that the people feel useful and have a relationship to the world around them, that where even if they don't form attachments right away, there's a context where they can build those attachments. Corona literally severed those attachments. People are not allowed, depending on the severity of the lockdown, they're literally not allowed to go walk down the street and hug their friend or see their friend's face. Like, it's a really intense kind of objective cutting of attachments and prevention of a lot of this. Well,
I mean, just the attachment drives. I apologize. The attachment drives the necessity, if that makes sense, right? Because once you have and this is back to the very beginning, my first kind of comment on what Galloway had to say, right? Is that 30 years ago, right, younger people controlled more wealth. And why did they control more wealth? Because, in my opinion, it's in large part because they formed attachments earlier. And it's that attachment that gives you that driving purpose and that need to do something, if that makes sense. And I think you froze. But I still hear you, but your picture froze. I mean, that's a piece of it. I mean, like, one of the conservative arguments against kind of welfare and a welfare state. Oh, I apologize. Where did I lose
my
you?
end.
Where did I lose you, Matthew?
Yeah, it broke up for a second, but I mean, there I am. So you could take this and
completely lost Matthew now. It's just me. Having a conversation with myself is a little bit less than entertaining. Here comes Matthew. We'll let him back in. 1 second. All right, and we have Matthew back. I found myself in front of a camera by myself, and I was like,
Right,
have a
right.
conversation with
I'm
myself,
reminded of
it won't be that interesting.
I'm reminded of the Louis C.K. routine where it's like how angry you can get that like a new technology that you didn't have 20 minutes ago. Like
I
now
love that. You're sitting in a chair in the sky.
in the sky. And I'm using my phone mobile hotspot
Right.
because
Well,
yes.
lost you again. Oh, there you are. You're back.
So the fact that it's not perfect.
So I was just kind of getting in a meandering fashion about this idea that one of the conservative objections to state welfare is the opioid crisis. It's that there is a kind of there's I'm not frozen, just in case you're watching.
The sign language. See if any of it comes through.
There you go. Did you catch what I just said about opioids? And we're back to having technical difficulties. And hopefully Matthew will dial back in, but that's kind of the gist of the point. I guess I've said it twice to the world, and 0 times to Matthew because he didn't hear me. And really, I have these conversations with which to talk to Matthew because I find them interesting.
Miracles of modern technology.
There you go. Did you get the opioid point I made?
Nope, but I believe you.
No, I was just suggesting that before I was kind of riffing on this attachment thing as being kind of a driver of purpose, right? And that's what drove wealth creation at younger ages, and that now kind of the conservative argument against welfare is this idea that is that when you just give people like what they need, they lack that purpose. A job kind of does give them that purpose, and that's what led to the opioid crisis. I mean, obviously many factors. I'm blaming the entirety of the opioid crisis on welfare.
No.
It's just like
I agree with you. I'm not sure which was first, like chicken or egg. It's depending on how, so to speak, welfare is given to people, it could be really demoralizing. Just the nature of human psychology is if you're getting supported by somebody else without doing anything to earn that, for the person receiving the aid, it's that sort of gratitude is really hard to handle gracefully. Let's put it that way, especially if it's coming from the government. And similar to technology, we all have what's called entitlement effects. We get used to receiving things. We get used to things working and being clean and being safe. We take that for granted. Water was delivered to everybody in Los Angeles County today. Oh my God. Like, that's not a headline. So you're right, hardship by the specter of being unemployed and homeless and hungry and in the street. Liberals tend to believe that if someone is struggling with things, it's not necessarily their fault, and we should be helping them get to a point where they can contribute their gifts to society. And we maybe should assume that if they're having trouble finding work or whatever, that maybe it's our fault and not their fault, that maybe we haven't given them the right training or support, or maybe we're not giving them enough psychological help or whatever. And I think both of these are true. And the big, the turning point is the sort of dignity with which that relationship happens. And I think you hit a really, really big, so to speak, conversation nobody wants to have when you said the opioid crisis. Manufacturing left America and moved to China. and
You're
moved to
breaking
other
in
places.
and out.
And a huge amount, I think, I've heard that 4 or 5 million jobs, manufacturing jobs in America were lost. And a disproportionate number of the people who used to work in factories, rather than getting other jobs or retraining, a huge number of them went on workers' comp and disability. That's the direction they went. And these are men in their 40s and 50s. This is actually not the young men. These are the guys who worked in factories all through the 70s, 80s, or 80s, 90s, until those factory jobs got less secure, and then went away. Unions were destroyed for a lot of different reasons. And then rather than get other jobs or move to the coasts or whatever, they stayed in these, smaller cities, Rust Belt cities, and got prescriptions for opioids. And it was a sort of increasing cycle, and they lived off of their workers' comp, and they said they were hurt. And so if you say you need painkillers because you're in pain, because that's what generates your workers' comp income, you have a really perverse set of incentives. You have all kinds of moral hazards. My cousin, who's a doctor, he will not work with a single, he does do all sorts of interesting sports medicine and rehabilitation stuff, but he won't work with anybody who's on workers' comp, because he finds that the integrity of the process is completely out of whack. That if they're getting workers' comp is dependent on him saying that they're in pain and giving them prescriptions, he's not going to be able to cure them, because they're going to say that they need to stay in pain. So it's you're right. It really demoralized a huge chunk of America. And I think this is one of those giant conversations that nobody wants to have.
So are you blaming the, no, that's fine. I think I got the gist, but are you blaming the system of work comp for I'm kidding. I mean, I think that everything comes down to, you can't hear me, can you? Oh, you're blaming it.
I can hear you.
I think everything kind of comes down at the end of the day to a combination of perverse incentives, moral hazards, and unintended consequences. And I mean, that's just a kind of a worldview of mine. Like everything kind of boils down to those three. I mean, there are the other factors that kind of get mixed up in that, but those factors kind of underpin all of the issues, and kind of disintermediating those problems is difficult, because it's like I always say, it's one of the reasons I'm as anti kind of government intervention as I am, is because people ask about why is there corruption in politics, and to me the answer is very simple. It's like, because they have a big pot of money, right? So and they have this kind of bias towards solutions. Like if you think about COVID, right, all this lockdown stuff, it all comes down to this notion that, in my opinion, like, it's all about an action bias, meaning it looks like I'm doing something, and therefore I am doing something, and therefore when it's over, I can say, look, I did something, right? Rather than, it's not a great strategy to say, guys, let's just kind of like everybody be careful, and we'll all, we'll kind of get through this. And if you're older, be more careful, and if you're younger, you could be less careful, but let's keep the economy going. No, and I've said, no, I'm locking this shit down. I can point to the later and say, yeah, I did that, and that's what caused the change. Even though, now more and more articles are coming out that are showing, and more studies are coming out showing that lockdowns actually have very little impact. And if you compare, there's a number of side-by-side comparisons you can do among states that had lockdown light versus lockdown heavy, and the differences are not within the United States. The differences are not that dramatic as one might expect. Also, not significant enough to justify the cost.
Yeah, it forces people. Right, and forcing people indoors clearly is counterproductive, because it spreads indoors and not outdoors. But yes. Well, so you said before, like, we don't want to just wait for better leadership to take over. We are putting our book out there and hopefully influencing the discourse, but also like that is another of those small but very powerful points that Jordan Peterson makes a lot. What can we do? We can stop lying. like that whole big narrative that we just told about manufacturing and the opioid crisis and workers' comp, a lot of it was driven by a couple of very well-meaning lies about globalization. Global leaders decided that it'd be a good thing to encourage bringing the third world, bringing huge parts of China and Vietnam and Thailand and sub-Saharan Africa and South America and India as much into first world integration of our whole world economy, moving a lot of factories there, giving people jobs, innovating there, building infrastructure there. And it's been, since the 80s, unbelievably successful. And
On a global scale.
1.5 billion on a global scale. 800 million people in China alone have moved from like third world poverty, like you couldn't even believe, to levels of standard of living and access to that material wealth that we were talking about and purchasing power parity equal to the Western middle classes. 800 million people out of their 1.4 billion. So they got 600 million more people that are still poor, but it's like that movement is so amazing. And hundreds of millions of people in China and these other. Well, let me just
no, go ahead.
Finish it. That was accompanied by a lie told to Western publics. That the lie told to Western publics is that globalization is good for you. Globalization was wonderful for people working in factories in China and for the people building the Chinese economy and for some other countries. But for the Western middle and lower classes and manufacturing workforce, it wasn't so good. And they didn't tell us the truth about that. And that lie, I think, led us down a really bad path.
I'm not even sure it wasn't so good for us, by the way, even as the middle and lower middle class. Yes, there have been. Yes, there are certainly problems that have kind of arisen from it, and major problems. I'm not going to say no, but again, back to the wealth thing that I was saying earlier, is that even still today, even the poorest people in America on some level are extremely wealthy by historical standards. The fact that you can carry, not that this does a lot for a lot of people, and hasn't increased happiness. And I think that might be the problem. It hasn't increased people's purpose and their feeling of purpose. But I mean, everybody, even like the poorest people in this country, have smartphones, right? I mean, very, very few people do not have a smartphone, do not have access to the internet, which access to the internet gives you access to all of the world's information and misinformation all at once. And what you choose to do with that. Like, I remember this moment back in 2009 when I got my first iPhone, and I walked around for like weeks, like in awe. It's like just kind of over and over again. Like, they let me carry the internet in my pocket. Right. And then it devolved into like Candy Crush and stuff like that. But, there was this, and so yes, and globalization built that, because without the global supply chains, Apple would not have been able to kind of initially develop the iPhone. I mean, there's this great clip of Steve Ballmer, who was then CEO of Microsoft, laughing at the notion of a $500 phone. Who's going to pay $500 for a phone? He lived to kind of regret that kind of tremendously. But even at the time, that was a huge risk for a company like Apple to take, because, like, will people be willing to pay for that? And not only that, but then the data plan to go on top of that, it was tremendously expensive. And had they tried to develop that technology in the United States with prevailing wage, that would not have happened. So I disagree with the notion that globalization was bad for American middle class.
I tried to be specific about it.
Yeah, I know. It's just a matter of there are matters of perspective, and there are matters of whether you shift what you put your focus on, relative versus absolute. And this is not at all, just to be clear, not to discount anybody's individual struggles or the the plight of the middle class in this country, because I think they are facing issues, and I think that those issues need to be solved.
Right. Those are the lies, though, that I think are really important, is that there's a threshold It's not just relative. There's a threshold above which they call it, the poverty line or whatever you want to call it. If you're above that line, there's a certain level of security you have about your basic things and, your ability to pay your bills each month that even if you're in a materially wealthy society, if you're below that line, it's a really, really terrible human experience. If you're a young man and you're able-bodied and you want to work and there aren't any jobs, it's a really demoralizing, difficult experience. Right now, if you're in China and you're a young man and you want to work, there's jobs. There's a lot of jobs. In every city, there's factories. I went and inspected and supervised production runs at factories all over China, and like hundreds and hundreds of people in every one of these factories. They're so excited to have this job. And in that, in that town, that job, even though it pays, not well by American absolute standards, that's enough for them to, buy a house, build attachments, break even, live pretty well as far as food, have a vacation to the countryside. Those jobs, and it's more like that threshold of opportunity that says, you're a young man, you don't have any specific skills, but you are healthy and willing and able to work. Is there a job for you? And if the answer is no, which in a lot of like Rust Belt towns in America, the answer is no, it's really, really big problem. If the answer is yes, which in like Nanchang, China, the answer is yes. So it's with all the other relative things, there's a yes no at a certain threshold there. And if those young men have something to do and have a job, have a path forward of utility and dignity and purpose, at a certain level, that is much more important than having a smartphone.
Sure,
I mean, I agree with you that those are all great material things.
And I'm going to talk
psychology of sort of humans.
I'm going to talk past you for a second, hopefully, in order to come around to some kind of deeper understanding. And that is, I would bet you that young man in Nanchang, China, who's working for subsistence wages and able to propel things forward, does not have a couch in a parent's basement that he could sit on.
Especially if he came from the countryside, for sure not.
And so therefore, I wonder to what extent that some of these problems are fueled by our prosperity and not by, and the lack of necessity, if that makes sense. I mean, there's an old adage that says necessity is the mother of invention or innovation. And so, and I'm not, please, I mean, obviously, I'm not here to blame, I'm not blaming anybody, or I'm not saying that this is, this or that. I'm just I'm trying to think in the bigger idea space and not the kind of the specific individual space. Meaning, and I mean, obviously there are times when there are no jobs, but for the most part, there are jobs. And I've encountered this many, many times in my life of people that I know or people that I've seen that are, there's no job. And there's always on some level, some job somewhere. It might not be the job you want. It might not be the job that, obviously there are times when there are just no jobs. It's just when the economy is just very, very rough or closed by government edict. That makes it a little more difficult, but in kind of regular, normal times.
Yeah. No, you brought me to, okay, so maybe this could be our topic for maybe a next conversation, but you made me think of kind of the original American ideal. The reason they found, or the way they founded America, was very much built on this idea of anyone can go leave a situation of exploitation and limitation and can go into this sort of ever expanding wilderness and homestead. Carve out a plot of land for themselves. Nobody's helping them, but nobody's preventing them. And they're gonna just find some land in Ohio and turn it into productive farmland. And there was this sort of Thomas Jefferson yeoman farmer ideal that every man should have the liberty and freedom and to pursue his happiness by carving a living out by his own the effort of his own two hands. And there was a sort of idea of that being the sort of fundamental unit of a democracy was a self-sufficient man. So maybe there's something there that we could pick up next time, because I think you're absolutely right. And whether that ideal is a right-wing ideal, a left-wing ideal, I think it's at the heart of like what we think of as like the human male life cycle. You grow up, you leave your parents' house, and you carve out a living for yourself. How do you do it?
I don't have any wings, so I can't tell you if it's left or right. But yeah, I think that this is at least a part. And I think that does kind of cut very much to the left-right divide, and whether one side tends to emphasize personal responsibility over communal responsibility, and the other over communal over personal, and kind of the lack of a balance. I mean, the reality is, as with most things, you need kind of a balance between the two, right? And that's how you can create productive environments. It's the community's job to create productive environments, and it's the individual's job to thrive in those environments and figure out how. And because I think in a lot of ways, because each side is entrenched in their simplistic, this is the be all end all, my way is needs to be supreme, that leads us down the path of neither, right, to some extent.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to perverse incentives and moral hazard. I would actually say our two-party system has a perverse incentive to make those two sides, whenever they take power, they try to set up things that any policy that'll encourage personal responsibility is going to be hamstrung from the start. And then when the right wing takes power, they try to hamstring any policy that's going to give communal support for people and make it, humiliating and difficult and all these things. And so you have both sides who have enough power to hamstring the other's ideals. Yeah, that's a good. It's a good way to ensure that neither one achieves their ideals.
Correct. I was once had a conversation with Congressman Paul Ryan, which, I mean, a lot of people have views on the man, but one of the things that he said that struck me like really deeply was his kind of desire for welfare reform, which was pitched as exactly that. It was painted by the blue team as being, absolutely hateful of the individual. One of the things that he was trying to roll back and accomplish was this idea that he wanted people to feel every incremental dollar, that every incremental dollar that they earned put incremental dollars in their pocket. Maybe not a whole dollar, but there's this weird thing it's fairly well known. It's called the welfare cliff, right? There's a point where it's like, if you actually go out and earn more money, you actually lose money when you take into account the fact that you lose all these government benefits. And that just, that's an absurdity. And once again, and I'm not to say that there's one side or the other here that's less or more absurd. I think there's a lot of absurdity on both sides, but that notion, I think, is, not to put a team on it. I'm not here advocating for one team or the other. I think that we need to kind of figure out how to get together and find solutions that work across the board, because it is important to create kind of the communal element and also the individual element, because one without the other, it just doesn't work.
Yeah, it sort of almost reminds me of that old Super Bowl commercial with like, less filling tastes great. Like, obviously you can't have ultimate of both of those things, because if it's not filling at all, it's not going to taste like anything. It's going to be water. And if it just tastes great, it'll probably be pretty unhealthy. So, it's absurd to have these sort of two-sided discussions. So maybe that's a good note to leave it on, that we are the authors of, I do not think that word means what you think it means. Pick up our book on Amazon, on the hard copy, on Kindle, and thatword.org. And our podcast is available on Spotify, Apple, and I think everywhere else that you can find podcasts. And you should be able to still see this again live on Facebook. Should be stored there for a while. So
Well, it's on Facebook. There's also a YouTube live, so it'll be on YouTube forever until they take it down.
Awesome. And so we are the Fairness and Freedom Friends Foundation. And thank you all for your attention. And we'll see you next week.